Amen. Praise God. Hello, church. It's good to be back with you. It can be good to be away, but then when you're away from home, it just doesn't seem the same. We've had quite an eventful few weeks. Just before we left, I had an automobile accident. 3 people involved because of 2 careless drivers. It was where there was 2 roads that were converging, and somebody decided they wanted to get out of theirs and get into ours. And so 2 cars together came in, and the 2 people ahead of me stopped. I think it's a good idea that if something like that happens, don't stop. Keep moving, even if it's a little bit, because they didn't really get their cars hurt very much, but my car is pretty much wiped out in the front end. So waiting to find out what we can do about that. Were at camp. I was at camp meeting. Brenda flew separately to Reno from our son's graduation from the internal medicine program at the university. And then we helped them pack for their move. They're going to be moving to Park City, Utah. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay, it's where they're going to have the next Winter Olympics, I believe. Up on top of the mountain. Is it 7,000 feet up? Something like that. Way, way up. Anyway, and so we were packing boxes, storing them in the garage. And then we got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to come back home. And when we got there, we found out our flight was canceled. So we were both really tired, so we waited about 3 or 4 hours to call our daughter-in-law, and we got a taxi over so we could spend 2 or 3 hours of sleep before we had to go on. So we lost a whole day, and then we had to fly from Reno to San Francisco to Newark, New Jersey to Wilmington. So it's been kind of a wipeout for us this week. But as I said, it's good to be home. It's good to be with you. And we've missed our church family. I share a message from Ecclesiastes, the 11th chapter. We're almost done. And it's taken us about, how long? Way over a year to get this far. But we're looking at Ecclesiastes 11, and as you saw in the scripture reading, we begin with an interesting phrase that I know that we've all heard before. Cast your bread upon the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. My father's career was in financial management. He was always good at figures. He could remember a long list of clients and phone numbers just off the top of his head. Well, I never got those genes. I must have got them from someplace else in the family. I have to write things down. I have a calendar not in my head, but I have it in my office, and I have to carry things around to keep them straight. He sold life insurance for much of his career. He was trained by the Prudential Insurance Company. Later, he worked for the Paul Revere Insurance Company, a small company from New England that he really enjoyed working with. Later, they were bought out, and so he moved on. Actuarial statistics ruled the day. What was your risk to the company to insure you? Most often, a medical examination was required to get the best rates. It was whole life in those days. And then came term insurance. Then a combination of the two. Then insurance became connected with comprehensive financial planning. And it got more and more complicated. Dad spent the last working years of his life working for the Chesapeake Conference in the Trust Service Department, as he was knowledgeable in that field. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 begins with that curious suggestion that I just read. Many wealthy people have found the joy in giving away large sums of money for the public good. Think of John D. Rockefeller, for instance, and his foundation that he left behind. You know, he was a dog-eat-dog businessman. If you've ever studied the late 19th century, there were a whole lot of people like that. And they all left inheritances behind, not just for their children, but for their country. John D. Rockefeller, the Rockefeller Foundation, now is worth $3.7 billion. That also included restoring Colonial Williamsburg. I don't know if you knew it or not, but it was John D.'s money that fixed that place up as a wonderful outdoor living history from our country's founding. I think of the Ford Foundation that Henry Ford left. His foundation is now worth $13.7 billion. The Carnegie Foundation, which started libraries all over the country, free libraries. And then we think of some names that are maybe a little bit closer to home. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance. Now, I don't know how they managed this since they've recently divorced. Those must be interesting board meetings that they have. But the one thing that they became focused on was eradicating malaria as a major problem in Africa. And that's worth $50.2 billion. The largest foundation, money-wise, isn't even an American company. Novo Nordisk Foundation from Denmark, $120.2 billion. Now, this money is invested. It isn't all used. The interest that it gets from the investments of the foundation are what funds the different charities that they support. What we're looking here at in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 is a challenge. It's a challenge to take risks. Risks are a part of life, aren't they? There's a lot of different ways in which we risk. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. What we're looking at here is risking for helping others in need, casting your bread upon the water that in due time it will return to you. Generosity towards others in need is what's being talked about. To risk your own loss for the benefit of those who have very little. Do you ever do that? I was at a gas station in Reno a while back, I guess it was last week, and this guy came up to me and said that he needed to get home and he needed $5 to get some gas in his tank. Now, I don't know why people drive away without any money, but I guess maybe he left it. And most people don't use money anyway. They use plastic, don't they? That's what I use much of the time. But I didn't quibble with him. I didn't tell him that I thought that maybe he was taking advantage of me. I went ahead and gave him the money. That wasn't that much of a loss for me to do that. I think when you're giving money away, it's a good thing to answer the question whether, if you never get the money back, and if it's somebody that you know, usually you'd expect to, that you wouldn't say anything about it. How much could you afford? Well, $5 is pocket change anyway. $5 is like 50 cents when I was a kid. So money is cheap today and is almost valueless. But I remember an Adventist young man that loaned quite a bit of money from me. And I had to answer the question, and I did in my own soul, what if I never get it back? Because we're not supposed to ask for it back. You know that, don't you? If you can't live with that, then don't give it. If it's true, tell them you can't afford it. Or you could offer some smaller amount that might help them along the way to meeting their need. And I never mentioned anything to him. And then, when Brenda and I were wed, he was there, and he gave me the money. I was kind of surprised. I just kissed it goodbye. But he was a fine young man, and I've thought a lot of him ever since. Few of us think of ourselves as wealthy, and I would expect that most of us here aren't. You can count on the fact that the pastor is not wealthy, okay? I don't know if you knew this or not, but this year, all the Adventist colleges and universities in North America only came up with a combined 90 to somewhere between 90 and 95 pastoral graduates. Do you know how many they need in North America? 1,000. People aren't going into the ministry anymore, folks. They can do better in business. And we don't complain about our income. I think that we do fairly well. But I remember mentioning one time in a conference, executive committee meeting, when I was in another conference, and they were talking about finances and so forth. I said, you know who supports the ministry in North America? The wives of the pastors. Many make a lot more than the pastor makes. And they have subsidized the work. So if you're appreciative for the work of ministers, give my wife a good thanks. And as I do, she works very hard. I'm proud of you, honey. I really am. And the Lord gave me a woman that didn't believe that she could be a pastor's wife, but she's a better pastor's wife than I am a pastor. I can tell you that. And those are even harder to find. So we're being challenged here to take a risk for those in need. And this kind of goes right along with, I think, what Johanna is promoting. And I hope that many of you will stay after the dinner today as she fills us in with the details of the Eden Village that's going to be opened. When is the date again? June 30th. It's a Friday. Some of you might be able to get there. I'm going to be there for sure. Does anybody here not know what the Eden Village is? It's a new concept, really. It's something that a lot of caring people have come up with. What do we do with the homeless? There's a lot of different kinds of homeless, okay? A lot of different kinds. And there's one particular kind that this village is going to benefit. And it's small, tiny houses put together in a planned community on land that's been donated. And there's a lot of different people that are supporting it. And we're very hopeful, as they have seen this done in other places, it benefits these folks. It helps to rehabilitate these folks. And not too many of them stay on more than, is it about a year to a year and a half? I think it's something that what the doctor told us about that. And the people actually move on in their lives. And I think that this church needs to support that ministry. This church has a lot of different ministries that we work with, because God wants us to take a risk for the benefit of others. Did heaven take a risk for us?
Yep.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were all involved in this, even though Jesus was the one who took on him flesh and made himself vulnerable to this world. How did that turn out? Well, from our values point, we'd say, well, Jesus took it on the chin. And he did. But he did it out of love and generosity. He held nothing back. Now let's take a look here at the following verses, and some of it is related to this and some moves on, because what we get to next about risk is that risk is godly. I just touched on it. Verse 2, divide your portion to 7 or 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth. That's very interesting. It's kind of an advice to divide whatever you do have into portions and to manage that, because you don't know. Now, I can tell you, and maybe I've not told Brenda always, but I have always kept behind a little fund. And it isn't large, fairly small, but sometimes she's come to me and she says, we can't pay a bill. And I'll say, well, I'll tell you what, we can pay it. And I'll pull it out. Now, I don't have a lot of that. Like I said, I'm going to get in big trouble if I gave you the thought that I've got thousands of dollars put away in a drawer somewhere. I don't. But we follow along as we come to verse 3. If the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls towards the south or towards the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. Now, we're going to leave that there for just a minute. I thought we'd turn to something that Jesus said, a couple of texts that you might like to reference. The first is Matthew 10, verse 39. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life will find it. Are we the children of God? We profess to be the children of God. Are we the children of God? The children of God are the ones who imitate and follow and absorb the values of the God that we claim to worship. And what is the God that we claim to worship? What sort of being is he? No, I'm not talking about, spirit versus body or anything like that. I'm talking about character. Let me remind you of something that the servant of the Lord told us, that the last great message that will go to a sin-sick world will be a message of the character of love of our Father in heaven. Ultimately, the greatest definition of our Christian perfection, if you want to touch on that subject, although it's an interesting, it isn't what you think it is. It isn't, well, I have the whole list here of 28 fundamentals and I follow every last one of them as often as I can focus and make myself. That's not it. What does John call God? What characteristic does he attach to him? God is, finish it, love. And I think that's what Solomon is trying to tell us here. In Luke 6, verse 38, give, and it shall be given to you. In truth, it's already been given to us, hasn't it? It's already ours. He is the first cause. Give, and it shall be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. This is what will be given to your bosom. For with the same measure that you meet withal, it shall be measured to you again. See, it's already been measured to us, hasn't it? Has God overfilled your cup? He's overfilled mine. And every time I'm studying the Word of God, and I'm overwhelmed. There's some insight in there that I come across about my unworthiness and His worthiness. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. That says it all. And then we continue here about after the tree falls. He who watches the wind shall not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap, just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of the pregnant woman. So you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. You know, if we're just a watcher, watchers don't get things done, do they? They like to watch other people do things. The watcher is not an activist. God is calling us to become activists. No, He's not calling us to carry a sign or chant some mindless mantra. He's calling us to lead with our heart, with the heart that He has given us, that He has transformed to have. And we get all past the politics and all the rest of it, and we get down to the basics, which is one person helping another person. Don't think about and don't feel that you have to take responsibility for all the ills that are in the world. You'll never get there. But we need to start paying attention to those that are near and close and do things like the Eden Village. The watcher will not sow. The clouds are full. The trees fall. We know not where. In verse 5, he who watches the wind will never sow. We know not the path of the wind, and we know not the mysteries of God's ways. Risk is necessary for survival. We risk or we perish. We must sow regardless of certainty. If we don't sow, we are certain that there is no survival. 100%. There are times when it seems as if sowing is futile. But if we don't put seed in the ground, folks, nothing will ever come up. We can never know the weather. We can never know how much sunshine and rain there'll be. But risk is survival. There are those that are risk averse. You remember the story of the 3 servants that were all given different amounts of money? What was the third one like? The first one had more, and he went out and invested it and made a lot more. The second one had less, but he went out and he invested what little he had. The third one decided that God was unfair, that his master always sowed where he hadn't reaped, and he didn't deserve. Well, it makes you wonder, why was he a servant? And so he went and buried it. Now, if you had buried money, say, 10 years ago, and you took it out today, how much would it be worth? Less than what you got. So a servant like that is really a thief, isn't he? It's very sad. To be risk averse is to be disinclined to take risk. Investments without risk bring no growth. None. Fourthly, we look at verses 7 and 8 and touch on 9 just a little, verse 10 just a little. We look at relationships, risk in relationships. It talks about light being pleasant, and that we should remember the darkness of death. Now, death is coming for us all, folks, unless Jesus gets here soon. And there's a lot of people that really believe that Jesus was coming, and he didn't. You know, we don't need to question the Lord. He loves mankind more than any of us do. And that's a shame. He wants to come back, but he wants to come back in a fashion and in circumstance where more people will be saved in his kingdom than if he just left it to us. We are never going to finish the work, folks. If that sounds like heresy, report me to the conference president. The Lord is going to do his own work. He wants to use us as instruments. He wants to penetrate every portion of the world to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, so that there'll be witnesses at the time they're needed. When events begin to shape themselves into the crisis that will be the end, the true end time. And God's message is what's important, not the organization. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is a useful organization to carry on the message of the last days. But we are not a different type of papacy or anything like that. We're not. We're a useful instrument in the hands of heaven to be able to share his message with the world in the last days when most people aren't looking in the right direction. And many are going to be deceived, but many also have a sense of truth, and they're unsatisfied. We've had several wonderful people join our church, and that was the case for them. They were looking for something more. And through God's grace, we were able to extend it to them. Are you ready to take risks? What kind of risk did Desmond Doss take on Hacksaw Ridge? Wasn't that many years ago? It was in the theaters, and we were giving out the books, that were about him. And I can't help thinking of that. They did it very good in the movie. He was the last one up there. And he didn't know what to do. And then he heard that voice. Medic. Medic. And so he stayed up there. After being up there all day, he stayed out there all night and into the next day, saving, I think it was 75 wounded soldiers that were out there, and most of them were being bayoneted by the Japanese soldiers. They like to bayonet people. What kind of risk was that? It reminds you of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We threw in 3, but why are there 4? Nebuchadnezzar asked. Desmond Doss was not alone any more than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. It was unseen. And the day's coming when we're going to have to stand without human support. But we need to remember that we're not alone. We are not alone, and neither are the millions of others that will be our brothers and sisters in going through that fiery trial. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all. And let him remember, verse 8, the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. And then he continues on. Verse 9, there's some hope here. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Now that's an interesting direction, isn't it? Is there any young man here that would turn that down? There's an appendage to it that we'll get to shortly. The impulses of your heart mean your emotions are strong at that time of your life. I remember when I was a teen in high school, I dated several different girls. Now talk about risk. That looms huge. You have to have a little bit of self-confidence to even try, And that was quite an experience. When I went to college, after I got out of the Army, I know that there was a particular girl that I was attracted to. She was very good looking. And she refused me 3 times. I didn't get discouraged, but I just figured that was God's answer. No. And what I didn't know, I found out later, was that she already had her eye on a particular guy. And she hadn't been able to get his attention yet, and she didn't want to show up with me on her arm. So I can accept that, especially the way it turned out. All the while, God was preparing me for a young woman in Orlando, Florida. I think of Proverbs 5, verse 18. Cherish the wife of your youth. And we've tried to do that. I've tried to do that with you, and you've tried it with me. And we've had many differences over the years, and we've worked it all out. And it's funny how many times one of us starts talking, and the other one was just thinking the same thought. It's almost like we do become one person. It's very special. Very special. If you are young, prepare yourself by gaining qualification, either by learning a trade or an apprenticeship or preparing yourself in school. Lastly, we come to the 5th. Yet know, verse 9, that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. Enjoy what he's offered, but within the bounds of God's revealed will. In Matthew 25, verse 34, we read, this is Jesus talking to his disciples about the end time. The king shall say unto those who are on his right hand, he separates the sheep from the goats, come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Verse 35, for I was an hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. And then in verses 37, 38, and 39, essentially, the righteous, that's who we're talking about here. When saw we thee all of these things, Lord? And the king shall answer, inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands how many of you love the Lord. I'm sure that almost all of you here, probably every single one, would answer that you do. And that's a good thing. And you should know that about yourself. But can two walk together except they be agreed? You know, the Hebrew word halach is the word walk. It doesn't mean putting one foot in front of the other and moving from one location to another. It has to do with living. It has to do with being in tandem with God. Think of Enoch. Enoch was taken to heaven, wasn't he? Because he walked with God. Mary Bartles wrote this story, and it was posted in Guidepost magazine. Our house was directly across the street from the clinic entrance of the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. We lived downstairs and rented the upstairs rooms to occupants at the clinic. One summer evening, as I was fixing supper, there was a knock at the door, and I opened it to see a truly awful-looking man. Why, he's hardly taller than an 8-year-old, I thought, as I stared at the stooped, shriveled body of this man. But the appalling thing was his face. It was lopsided from swelling and red and raw. Yet his voice was pleasant as he said, "Good evening. I've come to see if you've a room for just one night. I came for a treatment this morning from the Eastern Shore, and there's no bus until morning." He told me he'd been hunting for a room since noon, but had no success. Is it any wonder? No one seemed to have a room, even when they had a room. "I guess it's my face," he said. "I know it looks terrible, but my doctor says with a few more treatments, I can recover." For a moment I hesitated, but his next words convinced me. "I could sleep in this rocking chair on the porch. My bus leaves early in the morning." I told him we would find him a bed, but to rest on the porch. Meanwhile, I went inside and finished getting supper ready. When we were ready, I asked the old man if he would join us. "No, thank you. I have plenty," and he held out a paper bag. When I had finished the dishes, I went out on the porch to talk with him for a few moments. It didn't take long to see that this man had an oversized heart, crowded into a tiny body. He told me he fished for a living to support his daughter and her 5 children and her husband, who was hopelessly crippled from a back injury. He didn't tell it by way of complaint. In fact, every other sentence was prefaced with thanksgiving to God for a blessing. He was grateful that no pain accompanied his disease. Melanoma is like that. In fact, I had 3 church members in my Rock Hall church that were watermen. They didn't eat the crabs and the clams and so forth that they harvested, but they worked out on the water, and even the reflection of the sun off the water caused them all to get melanoma, one after another as they got old. And so many of them were taking treatments like this. By the way, there's a reason why they call it Rock Hall, and it's not because there's rocks there. It's because that's where they fish for striped bass. They're called rockfish. They grow in the Chesapeake Bay. He thanked God for giving him the strength to keep going. At bedtime, we put a camp cot in the children's room for him. When I got up in the morning, the bed linens were neatly folded and the little man was out on the porch. He refused breakfast, but just before he left for his bus, haltingly, as if asking a great favor, he said, "Could I please come back and stay the next time I have a treatment? I won't put you out a bit. I can sleep fine in the chair." He paused for a moment and then added, "Your children made me feel so much at home." Grown-ups are bothered by my face, but children don't seem to mind. I told him he was welcome to come again. And on the next trip, he arrived a little after 7 in the morning. As a gift, he brought a big fish and a quart of the largest oysters I'd ever seen. He said he had shucked them that morning before he left so that they'd be nice and fresh. I knew his bus left at 4 a.m., and I wondered what time he had to get up in order to do this for us. In the years he came to stay overnight with us, there was never a time that he did not bring us fresh fish, oysters, or vegetables from his garden. Other times we received packages in the mail, always special delivery, fish and oysters packed in a box of fresh young spinach or kale, and every leaf carefully washed. Knowing that he must walk 3 miles to mail these and how little money he had made the gifts doubly precious. When I received these little remembrances, I often thought of a comment our next door neighbor made after he left that first morning. "Did you keep that awful looking man last night?" "I turned him away," the neighbor said. You can lose rumors by putting such people in your home. Maybe we did lose rumors once or twice, but if only they could have known him. Perhaps their illness would have been easier to bear. I know our family always will be grateful to have known him. From him, we learned what it was to accept the bad without complaint and the good with gratitude to God. Recently, I was visiting a friend who has a greenhouse. As she showed me her flowers, we came to the most beautiful of all, a golden chrysanthemum bursting with blooms. But to my great surprise, it was growing in an old, dented, rusty bucket. I thought to myself, if this were my plant, I'd put it in the loveliest container I had. My friend changed my mind. I ran short of pots, she exclaimed, and knowing how beautiful this one would be, I thought it wouldn't mind starting out in this old pail. It's just for a little while until I can put it in the garden. She must have wondered why I laughed diligently, but I was imagining just such a scene in heaven. Here's an especially beautiful one, God might have said when he came to the soul of that sweet old fisherman. He won't mind starting in this small, ugly body. I have a quotation here from an author unknown that I jotted down. It's called Kindness. I have wept in the night for the shortness of sight that to some bodies need made me blind. But I never have yet felt a tinge of regret for being a little too kind. The ugly fisherman is always there. Where are we? Solomon pulls back the curtain of our own blindness and bids us to risk as he did and as his Lord did for us. Risk is actually simple faith as God sees it and has revealed it. Take risks for faith by taking actions that convey caring love. It's a call to joy in the Lord. Try it and you will discover his joy by giving and doing for his children in need. For God will judge how well we have loved, gave, and lived a life of action, not overcome by the darkness of death, but living in the light of truth with a character of love like his. Cast your bread upon the surface of the waters, and you will find it after many days. Father in heaven, we thank you for this wise counsel that challenges us to be risk takers for you, to treat one another the way that you wish them to be treated by those that have said that they are your followers. Help us to do better, Lord. Help us to be mindful. Help us to give in to those urges that in doing good we bring honor and glory to you.